Okay.
Hi.
Cortez and Montezuma by Pratt, Chapter 7. The Aztec War. The great palace in which the Spaniards were quartered was an odd-looking structure, made up of several buildings connected and having but one floor. In the very center there was an elevated partition, another story high, in which were separate rooms, like those in our own houses. Here and there along the parapets had been set their 13 great guns, and within the walls of the great enclosure was the entire Spanish army. They were crowded into the enclosure that, at the first sound of the trumpet, the army could be...
No, stop. Because that's got pesticides on it. Don't eat it.
Okay. They were crowded into the enclosure that, at the first sound of the trumpet, the army could be summoned and in a moment be ready for command. As the Spanish commander kept at all times the strictest discipline, and as the sentries were ever on the alert, it was impossible to take the army of Cortez by surprise. So it was that when the Aztecs were at last seen to approach, at one loud call, every soldier was at his post. Cavalry were mounted, the artillerymen at their guns, all ready for the command to act. On came the Aztecs, filled with terrible rage, their arrows, helmets, spearheads glittering in the sunlight, their many-colored banners flying, and, above all, the strange, terrible whistling, hissing sound with which the Aztecs were accustomed to sweep down like an angry tornado upon their foe. Now came a volley of stones, darts, arrows, raining down like deadly hail upon the waiting Spaniards. The Spaniards stood, quiet and firm, until the foremost ranks came within reach of the guns. One general discharge of artillery, and the Aztecs were mowed down like grass. For a second they stood aghast. Never had they seen the murderous power of Spanish artillery. For a second they staggered before the deadly fire. Then, with one great piercing yell of hate, they sprang forward over the bodies of their fallen comrades, their arrows and stones and darts whizzing like fire rockets. On they pressed, up under the very muzzles of the guns, scaling the very walls in the face of the Spanish marksmen who shot them down at every trial. Finding this of no avail, they attacked the parapet with battering timbers.
Wait, the Aztecs are attacking their own palace?
Well, they're attacking the Spaniards who are in their
But
palace.
technically, yeah, they're attacking.
But they're attacking the Spaniards. This, too, failed. Then, as a last resort, burning arrows and firebrands were aimed within the building. This was indeed a procedure for which the Spaniards had not prepared. Already the water supply for food and drink was running low. Should it then be used for protection against the fiery missiles? Already the wooden structures were blazing and crackling, the fire was spreading, and the smoke, blinding and suffocating, was pouring from every opening. It was indeed a desperate battle between the barbarian with his rude weapons, his savage hate, and the Spaniard with his deadly machinery, his science, and his deliberate, scheming cruelty. And as the thunders of his artillery roared and echoed among the hills, it seemed to tell only of death, death, death to the simple-hearted Aztec. Darkness came at last, and for a time there was peace. All night long the Spaniards worked, restoring their broken walls, repairing their battered guns, and removing their dead and wounded. I fed Panda. Okay, well, can you feed him? We're in the middle of a video, audiobook. All night long the Spaniards worked, restoring their broken walls, repairing their battered guns, and removing their dead and wounded. All night long the Aztecs watched, sending now and then some fiery missile crashing in upon the fortress. Cortez had never before known the fury of these Mexicans. So much had they borne from him with little resentment, so readily had they fallen back before his army, that he had come to think of them as a yielding, cowardly foe. And now, as he saw this storm of rage, he thought it but an uprising of a moment, sure to die away with the setting sun. But when the morning dawned, early as were the Spaniards up and in arms, Earlier still were the Aztecs. Instead of the discouraged remnant of an army which Cortez had expected to see, there stood a host, filling the great field and filling in from every side. Moreover, there was every sign of plan and order in the appearance. In a moment, the practiced eye of Cortez took in the scene. Some sort of a planned attack was on foot, and whatever it was to be, Cortez knew full well it would be a furious, sudden onslaught. Something desperate must be done. Some sudden, unexpected move must be made against them. And so, at the first movement of the Aztec forces, Cortez threw wide the fortress gates and sallied forth with all his forces. At full gallop, the Spanish cavalry set upon the foe, tramping underfoot, cutting down with broadswords or piercing with their lances the resisting forces. On followed the infantry, and for a moment the rout was fearful. The Aztecs fled only to their barricades, and from there sent forth such a volley of missiles that even the onset of the mighty Spaniards were for a time arrested. The guns were set upon the barricades, leveling them to the ground, but the Aztecs were not afraid. They beat back the Spaniards from the front and swarmed about them like bees on every side. The canals were alive with boats filled with warriors. Men were swarming to the attack from every road. Fresh battalions were forming in the squares, and the stones and arrows were whizzing from every quarter. Cortez began to see that at last the nation was aroused. Their city was their god. Annoyed and embarrassed by the heavy stones against which their heavy mail was no protection, the Spaniards began to burn the houses. This drew the Aztecs from their covers and made time and opportunity for the Spaniards. The day was nearly done. The Spaniards had at every attack broken down the Aztec force, although they still were in the field. At length, Cortez, satisfied with the day's success, sounded the retreat. During the entire retreat to their fortress, they were followed by the undaunted Aztecs, who pelted the retreating foe with stones and arrows. Then, settling in the darkness about the fort, they broke the stillness of the night with cries of vengeance and threats of terror. "Our gods have given you into our hands," they cried. "The sacrificial rites are ready. The wild beasts are roaring for you. The knives are sharpened. The cages are yawning for you." Cortez, who now realized the black hate of his foes, their terrible desperation, and their undying thirst for vengeance, listened to their threats and taunts through the long, dark night. He indeed mistook the character of the Mexicans when he judged them lacking in warlike spirit. What had seemed to him patient endurance, almost cowardice, had proved to be but the slumbering of a ferocity and daring of which he had not dreamed. The fury which, out of reverence for Montezuma's commands, they had so long restrained, had now burst forth. Their passions, their long-nourished sense of injustice, their long-suppressed revenge had broken out in the rage of the volcano, the whirlwind, the tempest. Realizing the furious storm about him, Cortez turned to Montezuma for aid. "Speak to your people," said Cortez, "and command them for their own temple's sake to cease this furious slaughter." But Montezuma was too full of disgust at the treatment he had received, too full of the scenes of the preceding day when he had watched the battle from his prison window, too full of despair, indignation, and grief to hear the words of Cortez. "What have I to do with him?" asked he, when word was brought that Cortez would speak with him. "I do not want to see him. I want only to die. Oh, to what wretchedness has my willingness to serve him brought me and my people. They would not believe me." Cortez, however, made him at last believe that if the enemy would only make a way for them, they would gladly march away. Then Montezuma, moved by the hope to spare his people's lives, consented to speak to them. Arraying himself in his imperial robes, his feet shod in golden sandals, he stepped forth upon the parapet. Instantly his presence was recognized by the Aztecs swarming about the walls. The voices were hushed, many prostrated themselves upon the ground, others bowed in reverence, all turned in longing expectation towards their king. With a strong, firm voice he said, "Why do I see my people here in arms against the palace of my fathers? Is it that you think your king is prisoner and wish to release him? If so, you have acted rightly.
Montezuma
But,
talking?
yes, to his people, but you are mistaken. I am no prisoner. The strangers are my guests. I am here with them from choice. I leave them when I list. Have you come to drive them from the city? That is unnecessary. They will go of their own accord if only you will open a way for them. Return to your homes. Lay down your arms. Show obedience to me who have a right to it. The white men shall go back to their own land, and all will be at peace again within our walls. For a second, the Aztecs stood still, amazed, confounded at their sovereign's words. Then, with one great yell of rage, bursting with contempt for their king's weak spirit, so unmindful of the great insult for which they suffered, they fell upon him, crying, "Base Aztec! Coward! Coward! Coward!" Then followed a shower of stones from the infuriated mob upon the sovereign, whom so shortly before they had looked upon with slavish awe and had bowed before in sacred reverence. Montezuma turned away. A great stone falling upon his head struck him senseless to the ground. A sudden hush fell upon the mob. The horror of their sacrilegious deed swept over them. Then, with one long, dismal cry, like the cry of a hunted animal, they turned and fled. The wretched Montezuma was carried within the fort. When at last his consciousness came back to him, and a sense, When at last his consciousness came back to him, and a sense of his wretchedness broke in upon him, he sank upon the floor, refusing to be comforted. I have tasted the bitterness of disgrace. I have been scorned by my people. I have been struck down by the rabble. Oh, I have no hope to live. Oh, my fathers. Oh, my fathers.
How many fathers you